Racist cop slaps black woman in front of her daughter but is shocked when she fights back. The evening air grew heavy with tension as Officer Mark Copeland's hand struck Alice Dixon's face, the sharp crack echoing through the park. 10-year-old Sarah watched in horror as her mother stumbled backward, one hand pressed against her reddening cheek. The playground fell silent, parents clutching their children close, their faces masks of shock and fear. But it was Alice's eyes that held the real story, not fear, not submission, but a quiet, dangerous resolve that made even Copeland take a step back. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the fabric of their small community, a change that would ripple through countless lives. Hey family, before we dive into this powerful story, take a quick second to drop a hearth in the comments with your location. Hit that like button, your support means everything. Let's witness justice unfold together. Alice Dixon hadn't always been the woman who stood her ground that day in the park. At 42, her shoulders carried the weight of a past that had shaped her into both a fighter and a protector. 15 years earlier, she had worn the same blue uniform as Officer Copeland, patrolling the streets of their small town with a sense of purpose and pride. Standing at 5 with athletic build and warm brown eyes that could turn steely when needed, Alice had been one of the department's most promising officers. Her career had been marked by distinction until the day she stumbled upon financial records that didn't add up. What started as a routine inspection revealed a web of corruption reaching into the highest ranks of the department. Missing evidence, unexplained bank transfers, and suspicious arrests, the pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Alice had been willing, and that decision had cost her everything. When she brought her findings to internal affairs, the system she trusted turned against her. Her fellow officers, once brothers and sisters in blue, started treating her like a pariah. Anonymous threats appeared in her locker. Her car was vandalized. But it was the day her backup arrived deliberately late to a dangerous call that finally broke her trust in the system. The department hadn't fired her outright, that would have been too obvious. Instead, they buried her in paperwork, assigned her to the worst shifts, and waited for her to break. When she refused to back down, they fabricated complaints and evidence of misconduct. The same system she had sworn to uphold branded her a troublemaker and forced her resignation. The betrayal had hit hard, but it was the impact on her daughter that truly wounded her. Sarah, just a toddler then, couldn't understand why her mother's colleagues no longer came to their house for barbecues, why other kids at the department picnics wouldn't play with her anymore. Alice had watched her daughter's innocent confusion with a heart that broke a little more each day. Single motherhood had never been easy, but life after the force proved especially challenging. No local department would touch her, and private security firms mysteriously withdrew their job offers. Alice had reinvented herself, taking a job at a local community center where she could still serve others, even if not in the way she'd originally dreamed. Through it all, Sarah remained her anchor. Every morning spent helping her daughter prepare for school, every evening teaching her to skateboard or helping with homework. These moments reminded Alice that she had made the right choice. She had lost her career, but kept her integrity, and more importantly, she had shown her daughter that standing up for what's right matters more than standing with the crowd. Years of martial arts training and street experience had taught Alice to read situations, to sense danger before it materialized. These skills hadn't dulled with time. If anything, civilian life had sharpened them. She needed them now more than ever, navigating a world where her former colleagues viewed her as a traitor and where justice seemed to work only for those with power and influence. The community center became her new battlefield. Instead of fighting crime with a badge, she fought inequality with education programs, after-school activities, and advocacy for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She taught self-defense classes to women, mentored at-risk youth, and slowly built a new kind of respect in the community, not based on authority but on genuine service and understanding. But the wounds of her past never fully healed. Every time she saw a patrol car cruise past her house a little too slowly, every time Sarah came home asking why some kid said her mom was a bad cop, Alice felt the old pain resurface. Yet she refused to become bitter. Instead, she channeled her experiences into teaching Sarah about resilience, about standing tall even when the world tries to push you down. That fateful evening in the park wasn't just about a confrontation with Officer Copeland. It was about every injustice she had witnessed, every compromise she had refused to make, and every lesson she wanted to teach her daughter about courage and dignity. Alice Dixon might have lost her badge, but she had never stopped being a protector of her daughter, of her principles, and of the truth itself. Officer Mark Copeland's darkness hadn't been born in a single moment, but had grown like a shadow fed by tragedy and guilt until it consumed the man he once was. At 48, his imposing six-frame and cold blue eyes had become symbols of fear in the community, but few knew the story behind his transformation. 8 years ago, Copeland had been a different man, married to Maria, a beautiful Hispanic woman whose warmth had melted his initial prejudices about interracial relationships. Their daughter, Sophia, had been his world, a bright-eyed 10-year-old who inherited her mother's bronze skin and his steel blue eyes. They had been his reason to believe in a better world, his proof that love could transcend racial barriers. That belief shattered on a rainy Tuesday evening. While Copeland was handling a routine traffic stop, deliberately prolonged by his need to assert authority over a group of black teenagers, Maria and Sophia were driving home from a dance recital. A drunk driver ran a red light, and by the time Copeland heard the call over his radio, it was too late. His family died while he was writing a ticket that could have waited. The guilt ate at him like acid. If he hadn't been so intent on demonstrating his power over those teenagers, he might have been off duty in time to pick up his family as promised. The psychological evaluation deemed him fit for duty after mandatory leave, but something fundamental had broken inside him. His grief twisted into rage, and he began seeing enemies in every face that reminded him of his loss. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Citations against minorities increased. Complaints about excessive force piled up. His fellow officers noticed the change but turned a blind eye, understanding that a grieving man needed outlets for his pain. The department's leadership saw his aggression as useful a tool to maintain what they called order in certain neighborhoods. Copeland became particularly harsh with black mothers and their daughters. Each one reminded him of what he'd lost, of the family life that had been snatched away. He couldn't bear to see their happiness, their intact bonds, when his own had been shattered. The sight of Alice and Sarah in the park that evening had triggered something primal in him, a toxic mix of envy, anger, and self-loathing. His reputation in the department was complex. Younger officers both feared and admired him, learning to emulate his aggressive tactics while carefully avoiding personal connection. The old guard appreciated his willingness to do the dirty work of maintaining their version of law and order. Only his partner, rookie officer James Sullivan, occasionally saw glimpses of the man Copeland used to be, moments of hesitation before harshness, flashes of pain quickly buried under anger. At home, Copeland kept a shrine to his lost family, but he never let himself linger there too long. The walls of his house were bare except for his commendations and police memorabilia. He worked double shifts, volunteered for the most dangerous calls, perhaps hoping that fate would grant him the reunion he secretly craved. The corruption in the department didn't bother him anymore. He saw it as just another symptom of a broken world, one that had taken everything he loved. When his superiors asked him to handle certain situations, he complied without question. His moral compass, once so clear, had been shattered along with his family's car that rainy night. But in his quietest moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Copeland would remember Maria's last words to him, "Mi amor, your strength should protect, not punish." These moments of clarity were becoming rarer, drowned out by the louder voices of anger and prejudice that now governed his actions. Looking at Alice Dixon in the park, he didn't see a mother teaching her daughter to skateboard. He saw everything he had lost, everything he could never have again. And in Sarah's eyes he saw an echo of Sophia that made his heart twist with a pain so acute it could only be expressed as rage. Officer Mark Copeland had become a weapon aimed at the world, but his deepest wounds were self-inflicted, festering beneath his badge of authority. The city park basked in the warm glow of early evening, families scattered across its well-maintained grounds like peaceful islands in a sea of green. Alice Dixon stood beside her daughter Sarah, watching with pride as the 10-year-old attempted to balance on her new skateboard. The scene was picture perfect until Officer Mark Copeland's heavy footsteps crushed the fallen leaves behind them. "You don't belong here," his voice cut through the peaceful evening air, carrying years of buried pain and prejudice. Alice's spine stiffened, her maternal instincts immediately kicking in as she subtly positioned herself between Copeland and Sarah. She recognized the look in his eyes she'd seen it countless times during her years on the force, the dangerous glint of authority unchecked by compassion. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Copeland's hand struck Alice's face with a crack that echoed across the park. Parents gasped, children froze, and Sarah's scream pierced the evening air. The sting of the slap was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in Alice's chest, the rage building beneath her carefully maintained composure. Mom Sarah's voice trembled, a mix of fear and disbelief coloring her words. The skateboard clattered to the ground as she grabbed her mother's arm. Alice could feel her daughter shaking, could sense the world shifting beneath them both. This moment would change everything she knew it with the same certainty that had once guided her investigations. Copeland stood there, his hand still raised, a flicker of something recognition, regret, or perhaps fear crossing his face as he realized what he'd done. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "That's what happens when you people don't know your place," he snarled, his voice carrying across the now silent park. Alice's response was measured, controlled, years of training evident in her stance. "Officer Copeland," she said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheek, "you just assaulted a civilian in front of witnesses. Think carefully about your next move." The use of his name, her knowledge of procedure, it caught him off guard, confusion briefly replacing anger in his eyes. The crowd that had gathered began to murmur, phones appearing in hands recording the confrontation. Copeland noticed, his jaw tightening as he realized his actions had an audience, but like a wounded animal, he became more dangerous in his desperation. He reached for his handcuffs, the metal glinting in the evening light. "Turn around," he ordered, advancing toward Alice. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting an officer." The absurdity of the charge would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious. Alice stood her ground, her mind racing through options, scenarios, consequences. Sarah's grip on her arm tightened. "Mom, please," she whispered, terror evident in her voice. It was this, her daughter's fear, that crystallized Alice's resolve. She wouldn't run, wouldn't submit, wouldn't teach her daughter that abuse of power should go unchallenged. "Officer," Alice's voice carried across the park, clear and steady, "you have no grounds for arrest. What you do have is assault, abuse of power, and racial discrimination, all caught on camera. Stand down." Her words carried the weight of experience, the authority of someone who knew the law from both sides. The confrontation had drawn more onlookers, phones recording, witnesses gathering. Among them, Alice noticed a familiar face, James Sullivan, Copeland's rookie partner, watching from the periphery with undisguised horror. His presence would matter later, she knew, when statements were taken and reports filed. Copeland's face contorted with rage and something else, recognition perhaps, as pieces of her identity clicked into place. "You're that cop," he spat. The one who couldn't keep her mouth shut. His hand moved to his weapon, not drawing it but making its presence known, a threat, a promise. Alice's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "And you're about to make the biggest mistake of your career." She turned to the crowd, raising her voice. "I want everyone to keep recording. Officer Copeland has already assaulted me once. Let's see what he does next." The tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Parents pulled their children closer, but no one left. They all sensed they were witnessing something important, a moment when the usual rules of power and submission were being rewritten. Sarah still clutched her mother's arm, but her trembling had stopped. She stood straighter, watching her mother face down the man who had struck her. In that moment, despite her fear, she was learning a lesson more valuable than any skateboard trick: the importance of standing up to injustice, no matter how frightening the consequences might be. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, as mother and daughter stood their ground against a system that had failed them both. The real battle, Alice knew, was only beginning. News of the park confrontation spread through the community like wildfire, cell phone videos circulating on social media, igniting fierce debates and drawing battle lines that would divide the town. By nightfall, Alice's phone buzzed constantly with messages, some offering support, others warning her to let it go, and a few containing thinly veiled threats. The local Facebook groups erupted in heated discussions. Some defended Copeland, citing his years of service and his personal tragedy. He lost his family, they argued, he's not himself. Others shared their own stories of encounters with him, a pattern of aggression emerging from the collective testimony. The videos showed different angles of the confrontation, each new perspective adding fuel to the growing controversy. At the community center where Alice worked, tension hung in the air the next morning. Her supervisor, Thomas Wheeler, called her into his office, his expression grave. "Alice, we're getting pressure from the city council," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Maybe you should take some time off, let things cool down." The implied message was clear. Her stance against Copeland was making powerful people uncomfortable. Sarah's school wasn't immune to the fallout. Children whispered in hallways, some repeating their parents' prejudices, others expressing confusion about why a police officer would hit someone's mom. The principal called Alice, expressing concerns about Sarah's safety, suggesting maybe she should stay home for a few days. But it was the reaction of her former colleagues that cut deepest. Officers she'd once considered friends drove past her house slowly, their presence a reminder of the thin blue line she had crossed years ago. James Sullivan, Copeland's young partner, left a voicemail that wavered between apology and warning Alice, "You don't understand what you're up against. Some things are bigger than just Copeland." The community split became physical. At the grocery store, some people crossed aisles to avoid her, while others made a point of standing close, offering silent support. The local diner where she and Sarah had eaten breakfast every Sunday for years suddenly couldn't find them a table. The message was clear: standing up to power had a price. That evening, as Alice helped Sarah with her homework, her daughter looked up with eyes too wise for her years. "Mom, why are people acting so weird?" "You didn't do anything wrong. He hit you." The question hung in the air, heavy with implications about justice, courage, and consequences. Alice pulled Sarah close, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, baby, doing the right thing isn't easy. People get scared, and scared people don't always stand with you. But that doesn't mean we stop standing up for what's right." Later that night, after Sarah was asleep, Alice sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of police regulations, civil rights laws, and witness statements. Her hand traced the bruise on her cheek, still tender from Copeland's strike. The easy path would be to let it go, to protect her job, her daughter's peace, their place in the community. But as she looked at the photo on her wall, herself in her old police uniform, proud and idealistic, she knew she couldn't back down. This wasn't just about one assault in a park. It was about every time power had been abused, every victim who had been silenced, every injustice swept under the rug in the name of peace. With determined fingers, she dialed a number she'd kept for years but never used: Derek Owens, a civil rights attorney known for taking on police misconduct cases. As the phone rang, Alice felt the weight of her decision. She was choosing a path that would change everything, not just for her and Sarah, but for their entire community. When Owens answered, his voice was cautious but interested. As Alice began to tell her story, she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. There would be no going back, but then again, she had never been one to retreat from a fight that mattered. This brave mother standing up against injustice deserves every single like, yet sadly that like button hasn't felt any love yet. Let's show Alice some support. She's fighting not just for herself, but for all of us. Hit that like button if you believe in justice. Derek Owens sat across from Alice in his downtown office, his expression unreadable as he studied the bruise on her cheek. The prestigious civil rights attorney, known for taking down corrupt officials, seemed different from what Alice had expected: younger, with sharp green eyes that missed nothing and an energy that suggested barely contained intensity. "Before we go any further," he said, placing a thick folder on his desk, "there's something you need to know." He paused, looking troubled. "I was hired 2 months ago to watch you, to gather information that could be used against you if you ever decided to speak up about what you discovered during your time on the force." The revelation hit Alice like a physical blow. She instinctively reached for her phone, ready to leave, but Owens raised his hand. "Please hear me out. What I discovered while investigating you changed everything. The corruption goes deeper than either of us initially thought." He opened the folder, spreading photographs across his desk. Alice recognized faces: prominent business leaders, city officials, high-ranking police officers. "They've built an empire," Owens explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Drug money, evidence tampering, witness intimidation. The park incident wasn't random. Copeland was ordered to provoke you, to create a situation that would discredit you if you ever decided to come forward." Alice's mind raced, connecting dots she hadn't seen before. The frequent patrol cars past her house, the sudden difficulties at Sarah's school, The community center's pressure, it was all orchestrated. "Who hired you?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. Police Commissioner Richardson Owens replied, confirming her fears. "But here's what they don't know. I've been building a case against them for the past year. Your situation could be the key to bringing it all down. That's why I'm coming clean now." He pulled out another document, his hand slightly shaking. "This is a recording from the day before the park incident. It's a conversation between Richardson and Copeland." He pressed play, and Alice felt her blood run cold as she heard the commissioner's voice make it public. Make it hurt, but make it look justified. She needs to understand what happens to people who don't stay quiet. "Why are you showing me this?" Alice asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Why risk everything by switching sides?" Owen stood, walking to his window that overlooked the city. "Because 15 years ago, my sister faced a similar situation in another department. She tried to expose corruption, and they destroyed her. She took her own life 3 months later." He turned back to Alice, his eyes fierce. "I became a lawyer to fight this kind of abuse, not enable it. When I saw you stand your ground in that park, protecting your daughter despite knowing the consequences, I knew I had to make a choice." "They'll come after you too," Alice warned, understanding the magnitude of what he was risking. "They already are," he smiled grimly, showing her his phone with its stream of threatening messages. "But here's what they don't understand: every threat, every attempt at intimidation, it's all evidence. We're not just fighting a dirty cop or a corrupt commissioner. We're fighting a system that's forgotten its purpose." Alice studied the evidence spread across his desk, her investigator's instincts kicking in. "This goes beyond just police corruption, doesn't it?" Owens nodded. "City contracts, zoning laws, drug trafficking, they've built a network that touches everything. Copeland's just a weapon they point at whoever threatens their interests, but he's also their weak link. That display of violence in the park, it wasn't part of their plan. He went too far. Let his personal demons take over." He sat back down, leaning forward intensely. "Alice, I know asking you to trust me after what I've just confessed is a lot. But if we work together, we can do more than just get justice for what happened in the park. We can expose the entire system." Alice thought of Sarah, of the lesson she was teaching her daughter about standing up for what's right. She thought of all the other victims who had been silenced, all the injustices swept under the rug. "If we do this," she said slowly, "we need to be smart. They'll come at us with everything they have." Owen smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "That's exactly what we're counting on. Sometimes the only way to expose corruption is to let it show its true face." He extended his hand across the desk. "Partners." "Mob." Alice took his hand, feeling the weight of the decision but also a surge of hope. "Partners," she agreed. "Now show me everything you have." The evidence Owen shared painted a picture more sinister than Alice had imagined. Spreadsheets, photographs, and surveillance reports revealed a network that had transformed their small town into a hub of organized crime, all hidden behind badges and business suits. Commissioner Richardson sat at the center, but the web extended into City Hall, the courthouse, and even the school board. "Look at this," Owen said, pulling up financial records on his laptop. "Every major construction project in the last 5 years has gone through shell companies connected to the commissioner's brother-in-law. The police department gets a cut for providing security, really just harassment of anyone who asks too many questions." Alice's eye caught a familiar name: Thomas Wheeler, my supervisor at the community center. The documents showed regular payments to his personal account, explaining his sudden pressure for her to take leave. "They bought everyone," she whispered, the betrayal cutting deep. More disturbing were the incident reports Owens had compiled. Dozens of cases where evidence had disappeared, witnesses had suddenly changed their stories, or investigations had been mysteriously abandoned. Each case touched someone connected to Richardson's network. The pattern was clear but cleverly disguised, spread out enough to avoid attention unless you knew exactly what to look for. "This is why they're so afraid of you," Owens explained. "You didn't just stumble onto some minor corruption during your time on the force. You found the edge of something much bigger. They've been watching you ever since, waiting for you to make a move." A photo caught Alice's attention: Copeland at a private meeting with Richardson and several known drug traffickers. The date stamp showed it was 3 days before the park incident. He was their enforcer, she realized. But something changed that day in the park. Owens nodded grimly. Copeland was supposed to intimidate you, maybe rough you up a bit. But when he saw you with Sarah, he paused, pulling out another file. Did you know about his family? The revelation about Copeland's lost wife and daughter hit Alice hard. The parallel between Sarah and his dead child, the timing of the park confrontation, it wasn't just about following orders. Something in Copeland had snapped that day, his personal tragedy colliding with his assigned task in a way Richardson couldn't have predicted. They're worried now, Owens continued. Copeland's become unstable, unpredictable. They can't control him like they used to, but they know too much about him to cut him loose. He's become their liability. Alice studied the surveillance photos, noting the increasing signs of strain in Copeland's posture, the wild look in his eyes. They'll try to eliminate him, she concluded. Make it look like suicide, probably. The grieving officer finally broken by his loss. Exactly, Owens confirmed, but that gives us an opportunity. Copeland might not realize it yet, but he needs us as much as we need him. His testimony could break this whole thing open. The implications were staggering. Taking down not just a corrupt officer or commissioner, but an entire network that had infected their town like a cancer. The risks were equally massive. These were people with resources, influence, and a demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who threatened them. Sarah, Alice said suddenly, her maternal instincts flaring. If they know we're looking into this. Owens was already nodding. I've arranged protection, people I trust, not connected to local law enforcement. But Alice, you need to understand, once we move on this, there's no middle ground. Either we take them all down, or... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Alice understood perfectly. This had evolved far beyond a simple case of police brutality. They were preparing to challenge a system that had spent years entrenching itself in every aspect of their community. Looking at the evidence spread before them, Alice felt a mix of fear and determination. The path ahead was dangerous, but the alternative, letting this corruption continue to poison their town, was unthinkable. She picked up the photo of Copeland's meeting with Richardson, her decision crystallizing. Show me the rest, she said. Every detail matters now. The next 3 weeks became a dangerous dance of investigation and survival. Alice and Owens worked methodically, building their case piece by piece while staying one step ahead of Richardson's network. Each day brought new discoveries, each more disturbing than the last, along with escalating attempts to silence them. The threat started subtly. Alice's car brake lines showed signs of tampering. Her home security system mysteriously malfunctioned. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night, breathing silently before hanging up. Sarah's teacher suddenly found fault with her schoolwork, suggesting she might need to repeat the year. The message was clear: back off, or things will get worse. They're getting desperate, Owens observed one evening, reviewing security footage from outside his office showing 2 known dirty cops lurking in the shadows, which means we're getting close. His desk was covered with documents connecting Richardson to a series of suspicious real estate deals, each one laundering money from drug operations through legitimate businesses. Alice was cross-referencing old case files when her phone buzzed a text from James Sullivan. Copeland's partner need to meet. Have info. Not safe to talk. Attached was a video clip showing Commissioner Richardson in his office raging about their investigation. Find out what they know, he shouted at someone off-screen, and make sure neither of them lives to testify. The meeting with Sullivan took place in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, chosen for its multiple escape routes. The young officer looked haunted, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. They're planning something big, he whispered, constantly checking over his shoulder. Richardson's called in favors from other departments. They're bringing in people with no local connections, professionals. Sullivan's intel proved invaluable, but it came with a price. The next morning, he was found in his apartment, officially an accidental overdose. The message couldn't have been clearer: there would be no more whistleblowers. Alice threw herself deeper into the investigation, her former detective skills resurfacing as she connected seemingly unrelated incidents. A series of accidental deaths over the past 5 years, all witnesses or potential whistleblowers. Property records showing how Richardson's network had systematically taken control of key locations throughout the city. bank statements revealing a complex money laundering operation disguised as community development projects. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Alice was reviewing footage from the park incident when she noticed something in the background: Copeland meeting briefly with a man she recognized from her days on the force. Enhanced images revealed a document changing hands, and lip-reading software confirmed their worst suspicions: contingency plans for eliminating problems. "Look at his face," Owens pointed to Copeland's expression in the freeze frame. "He's not just following orders anymore. Something's broken in him." The footage showed Copeland's hands shaking as he took the document, his usual stone-faced composure cracking. Their investigation revealed that Copeland had started keeping his own records insurance against the day Richardson might decide he'd become a liability. Hidden cameras in his home captured late-night visits from high-ranking officers, thinly veiled threats wrapped in concern for his mental health. But it was the discovery of Copeland's private journal that changed everything. Found by one of Owens' trusted contacts, its pages revealed a man torn apart by guilt, not just over his family's death, but over years of enforcing Richardson's corrupt agenda. "I became the monster I once swore to fight," one entry read. "Maria would be ashamed of what I become." The pressure kept mounting. Alice's apartment was broken into, nothing taken, but everything moved slightly, a psychological tactic meant to show she wasn't safe anywhere. Sarah started having nightmares, waking up screaming about men in shadows watching their home. Owens arranged for them to move to a safe house, but even that didn't feel secure enough. "They're in every system," he explained, showing Alice how their opponents had accessed sealed court records, private medical files, even school records. "They're trying to build a case against you, paint you as an unstable former officer with a grudge." The media started running stories questioning Alice's mental health, citing anonymous sources claiming she had a history of making false allegations. Old colleagues suddenly remembered incidents that had never happened, each account carefully crafted to undermine her credibility. But Alice and Owens had anticipated this. They'd been carefully documenting everything, building redundant systems to protect their evidence. "Let them think they're winning," Owens advised. "The more pressure they apply, the more mistakes they'll make." One night, reviewing surveillance footage for what felt like the 100th time, Alice noticed something they'd missed before. In the background of Copeland's confrontation with her, barely visible, was Richardson himself, watching from a distant park bench. The implications were staggering. The commissioner had been there, witnessing everything, perhaps even orchestrating the encounter. "This isn't just about silencing you anymore," Owens realized. "They're using Copeland as a weapon, but they're also setting him up to take the fall if things go wrong. A rogue officer with a tragic past, acting out his personal demons, the perfect scapegoat." The evidence was mounting, but so were the dangers. Each day brought them closer to exposing the truth, but also closer to potential disaster. Alice knew they were racing against time. Richardson's network was vast and ruthless, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate any threat to their operation. As she tucked Sarah into bed each night in their safe house, Alice wondered if she was doing the right thing. The path of least resistance would be to take Sarah and run, start fresh somewhere else. But every time that thought crossed her mind, she remembered her daughter's face in the park, watching her stand up to Copeland. Some lessons were worth any risk. "We're close," Owens assured her during their nightly strategy sessions. "But the endgame will be the most dangerous part. They'll see it coming, and they'll throw everything they have at us." Alice nodded, studying the web of connections they'd mapped out on the wall. At the center was Richardson, surrounded by corrupt officers, bought judges, and compromised officials. And somewhere in that web was Copeland, a man whose personal tragedy had made him the perfect tool for a corrupt system. "We're not just fighting for justice anymore," she realized. "We're fighting for the soul of this city." The evidence before them painted a picture of systemic corruption so deep it had become part of the community's foundation. Taking it down wouldn't just expose the guilty, it would shake every institution they had built. As the investigation deepened, the community's response to Alice's stand against corruption transformed from initial support to a crushing wave of isolation. Longtime friends stopped returning calls, neighbors crossed the street to avoid interaction, and Sarah's once busy birthday party invitations dried up completely. The weight of social ostracism settled over them like a heavy blanket. At the community center, the atmosphere grew increasingly hostile. Co-workers who had once shared lunch breaks with Alice now huddled in corners, their conversation stopping abruptly when she entered the room. Thomas Wheeler, her supervisor, finally delivered the blow she'd been expecting: administrative leave. Pending review. His eyes couldn't meet hers as he handed over the paperwork, his hands trembling slightly with what might have been shame or fear. Sarah's school became a battlefield of a different sort. The bright, confident child who had once loved learning began coming home with stories of exclusion and whispered taunts. "Why does your mom hate the police?" her former friends would ask. "My dad says she's crazy." The school administration, once supportive, now viewed Sarah as a liability. Her straight A's mysteriously became B's and C's, and her teachers found countless reasons why she needed extra attention. "Mom, why does everyone hate us now?" Sarah asked one evening, her voice small and confused as she pushed around the food on her plate. The question pierced Alice's heart, making her question everything she was fighting for. But it was Sarah's next words that strengthened her resolve. "I know you're doing the right thing, though, like you always taught me." The financial pressure mounted as the community's abandonment took its toll. Alice's suspension from the community center meant no paycheck, and finding new employment proved impossible. Richardson's influence reached far. Bills piled up, savings dwindled, and the stress began showing in ways both large and small. Even their church, once a sanctuary of support, succumbed to the pressure. The pastor, who had known Alice since Sarah's baptism, delivered a sermon about respecting authority while looking directly at her. The message was clear: their spiritual home was no longer welcoming. The isolation strategy was calculated and effective. Every withdrawn invitation, every turned back, every closed door sent the same message: standing up against corruption came at a devastating social cost. The community wasn't just abandoning them, it was actively participating in their punishment. Alice found herself struggling with moments of doubt, usually late at night when the weight of their situation felt heaviest. She would sit in their safe house, listening to Sarah's steady breathing from the next room, and wonder if the price of justice was too high. The evidence they were gathering could expose the corruption, but would it be worth the cost to her daughter's childhood? Owens noticed her struggle, offering what support he could. "They're isolating you because they're afraid," he explained during one particularly difficult evening. "A community that turns its back on truth is a community living in fear." But understanding the psychology behind their abandonment didn't make it any easier to bear. The breaking point came during Sarah's school talent show. She had practiced her dance routine for weeks, determined to show everyone that she wasn't beaten. But when she took the stage, half the audience turned their backs, a coordinated display of rejection that left the 10-year-old standing alone under the spotlight, tears streaming down her face. That night, as Alice held her sobbing daughter, something shifted inside her. The pain of community abandonment transformed into a steely determination. They weren't just fighting corruption in the police department anymore, they were fighting for every person who had ever been silenced by fear, every child who had ever been punished for their parents' courage. "We can leave," she offered softly to Sarah, stroking her hair. "Start fresh somewhere else." But Sarah, showing wisdom beyond her years, shook her head. "Running away doesn't fix things," she said, echoing words Alice had taught her in happier times. "And I'm proud of you, Mom, even when it's hard." The community's rejection had an unexpected effect. It exposed who their true allies were. A handful of people refused to join the collective shunning. Mrs. Johnson, Sarah's elderly neighbor, still brought over cookies and offered warm smiles. Mr. Peterson at the grocery store would slip extra items into their bags, refusing payment with a quick wink. These small acts of kindness became lifelines, reminders that not everyone could be intimidated into silence. Through it all, Alice and Sarah grew closer, their bond strengthened by adversity. Their evening ritual expanded to include not just homework help and skateboarding practice, but also discussions about courage, justice, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when standing alone. Sometimes, Alice explained one night, doing the right thing feels like the hardest thing in the world. But that's exactly why it's so important. Sarah nodded, understanding in a way no child should have to, but growing stronger for it nonetheless. The turning point came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, eerily similar to the night Copeland lost his family. Alice was reviewing surveillance footage in Owen's office when an urgent message came through from one of their informants. Richardson had given the order. Copeland had become too unstable, too much of a liability. They were moving to resolve the situation that night. "They're going to make it look like suicide," Owen said, quickly gathering his files. "A tragic end to a troubled officer. It's perfect for their narrative." The timing wasn't coincidental. Their investigation had revealed Copeland had been secretly collecting evidence against Richardson for months, driven by a growing awareness of how he'd been manipulated and used. Alice's instinct screamed that this was a trap, but she couldn't ignore the implications. Copeland, for all his faults, was now their most important potential witness. More than that, letting him die would mean letting Richardson win again, allowing another victim to be silenced. They traced Copeland to St. Michael's Church, where he often went to sit in the darkness after his family's death. The rain had intensified, making the old church look like something out of a Gothic nightmare. Through the windows, they could see Copeland kneeling in a pew, his service weapon on the seat beside him. "Two men approaching the back entrance," Owens whispered, monitoring their surveillance feed. "Another team at the front. They're Richardson's private contractors, the ones Sullivan warned us about before he died." Alice moved swiftly through the side door, her footsteps masked by the drumming rain. The church's interior was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Copeland didn't turn as she approached, though she knew he must have heard her. "They're coming to kill you," she said simply, stopping a few pews behind him. Richardson gave the order. Copeland's laugh was hollow, empty of any real humor. "I know," he replied, still not turning. "Been waiting for it. Probably deserve it. After everything I've done." His voice carried the weight of years of guilt and regret. "Your family wouldn't want this," Alice said softly, taking another step forward. "Maria and Sophia, they'd want you to make things right." At the mention of his family's names, Copeland's shoulders stiffened. "Don't you dare speak their names," he growled, but there was more pain than anger in his voice. "You don't know what it's like, losing everything, becoming something your own daughter would be ashamed of." "Then do something about it," Alice pressed, aware that time was running out. "Help us take Richardson down. Make their deaths mean something more than just another victory for corruption." The sound of footsteps echoing from both entrances cut through their conversation. The hit teams were moving in. Copeland finally turned, his face a mask of torment and indecision. "Why are you here?" he asked. "After what I did to you, to your daughter, you should want me dead." "Because letting them kill you means they win again," Alice replied, moving closer. "Because Sarah taught me that breaking the cycle of violence matters more than revenge." The first shot shattered a stained glass window, sending colored shards raining down around them. Alice dove forward, tackling Copeland as more bullets splintered the wooden pews. They rolled behind a stone pillar as the church erupted in gunfire. 4 shooters, Copeland assessed automatically, his training taking over. Professional by their movement patterns. They won't leave witnesses. "There's a way out through the vestry," Alice said, remembering the building plans they'd studied. "But we have to move now." She could hear the hit team coordinating their approach, working to cut off their escape routes. Copeland hesitated for a moment, then made his decision. He handed Alice his backup weapon. "I'll draw their fire towards the altar. You go for the vestry door." "That's suicide," Alice hissed, but Copeland's eyes had cleared, showing a determination she hadn't seen before. "Maybe it's time I did something right for a change," he said. Then, to her surprise, he added, "I'm sorry, Alice, for everything. Tell your daughter. Tell her I hope she grows up to be like her mother." Before Alice could respond, Copeland broke cover, firing at the hit team while running toward the altar. The assassin's attention shifted to him, giving Alice the opening she needed. She made it to the vestry door just as Owens appeared, providing covering fire from an upper window where he'd positioned himself. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space. Through the chaos, Alice saw Copeland take a hit to the shoulder, then another to the leg, but he kept fighting. He wasn't just buying time anymore, he was fighting for redemption, for a chance to die as the man he used to be rather than the weapon Richardson had turned him into. "Alice, go!" Copeland shouted, his voice strong despite his wounds. "Get the evidence to the FBI. Make it count." The last thing Alice saw before Owens pulled her through the door was Copeland standing at the altar, bleeding but unbowed, facing down the men who had come to silence him. The image would stay with her forever, a fallen man finding his honor again in his final moments. They made it to Owens' car just as police sirens began wailing in the distance. Too late to save Copeland, but right on time to clean up the scene the way Richardson would want it done. The official report would probably call it a suicide, write off the bullet holes and shell casings as evidence of Copeland's deteriorating mental state. As they drove through the rain-slicked streets, Alice's phone buzzed with a message. Somehow, in the midst of the chaos, Copeland had managed to send her one final text evidence in Sophia's music box. Make them pay. The rain continued to fall, washing away the physical evidence of what had happened in St. Michael's Church. But it couldn't wash away the truth that in his final moments, Mark Copeland had chosen redemption over survival, sacrifice over silence. The decision came in a split second, born from a place deeper than logic or self-preservation. As Copeland stood at the altar, bleeding but defiant, Alice couldn't let another person die in Richardson's web of corruption. Despite Owen's urgent whispers to leave, she turned back. "Cover me," she shouted, sprinting across the church floor as bullets splintered the wooden pews around her. She reached Copeland just as his legs gave out, catching him before he hit the ground. Blood soaked through her jacket where she pressed against his wounds. "What are you doing?" he gasped, his face pale from blood loss. "You should be gone." "Enough people have died," Alice replied, dragging him behind the altar as Owens provided covering fire from above. "Your daughter wouldn't want you to give up, and Sarah wouldn't want me to let you die." The mention of both daughters, one lost, one living, seemed to ignite something in Copeland. He fumbled with his phone, fingers slick with blood, sending a crucial message before passing out. Alice knew saving him would change everything, complicate their case, and potentially expose them to even greater danger. But she also knew it was the right thing to do. They escaped through an ancient tunnel beneath the church, part of an underground railroad network that Owens had discovered in his research. The assassins' bullets followed them, echoing through the narrow passage, but they managed to reach the exit where Owens had parked a second car. The decision to save Copeland had immediate consequences. Their safe house was compromised within hours, forcing them to split up. Sarah was rushed to a new location with trusted friends, while Alice and Owens worked to keep Copeland alive long enough to testify. A trusted doctor, one of the few allies they had left, treated Copeland's wounds in an abandoned warehouse. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, he revealed more about Richardson's operation than they had discovered in months of investigation. The guilt that had been eating at him poured out with his blood. "I was supposed to die that night," he muttered during one lucid moment. "The brake lines weren't an accident. Richardson arranged it, all my family's death, my revenge mission. He made me his weapon by breaking me first." The revelation stunned Alice. Richardson hadn't just manipulated Copeland's grief, he had orchestrated the tragedy that created it. The depth of the commissioner's corruption was even darker than they had imagined. But saving Copeland had put them all in unprecedented danger. Richardson's fury at the failed assassination attempt manifested in escalating violence. 3 more officers who might have testified were found dead. Owen's office was firebombed. Even Sarah's safe house had to be changed twice after suspicious vehicles were spotted nearby. The stress began to show on everyone. Alice barely slept, torn between protecting her daughter and keeping their key witness alive. Owens worked frantically to secure federal protection, knowing their local options were completely compromised. And Copeland, when conscious, swung between determination to testify and crushing guilt over his role in Richardson's crimes. "Why did you really save me?" he asked Alice one night, his voice weak but clear. "After what I did to you and Sarah." Alice took a long moment before answering, because fighting corruption isn't just about bringing down the guilty. It's about saving everyone it touches, even the ones it turned into weapons. The words seemed to reach something in Copeland. He pulled out a key he'd kept hidden in his shoe. "Sophia's music box," he said. "Everything's there, recordings, documents, names. I started collecting it after I realized the truth about the accident. Couldn't save my family, but maybe." His voice trailed off, but Alice understood. His evidence collection hadn't just been insurance, it had been his way of seeking redemption, even before he consciously realized he needed it. Their act of mercy had changed the game. Richardson's attempts to paint Copeland as a mentally unstable officer who died by suicide were now impossible. Instead, the failed assassination had created a trail they could follow straight to the commissioner's door. But the cost was mounting. Every day they kept Copeland alive was another day Richardson's network had to find him. Every moment Alice spent away from Sarah felt like a betrayal of her duties as a mother. The weight of their decision to save a man who had once struck her threatened to crush them all. Yet in those tense days of hiding, something unexpected emerged. Sarah, in their brief, secure phone calls, expressed pride in her mother's decision. "You always taught me that being brave means doing the right thing, even when it's hard," she said. Saving Officer Copeland was the bravest thing ever. These words sustained Alice through the darkest moments, reminding her that the path to justice wasn't always straight or simple. Sometimes it required extending mercy to those who least deserved it, finding humanity in those who had lost their way. Hey, beautiful souls. Every story of justice deserves to be heard. If Alice's courage touched your heart, help us spread these powerful messages of truth and redemption. Hit subscribe. Each new member of our family makes our voice stronger against injustice. Let's stand together. The weight of their choices became increasingly apparent in the weeks that followed. Alice's world had shrunk to a series of safe houses and burner phones, each day bringing new sacrifices and painful compromises. The hardest was the separation from Sarah, now hidden away with trusted friends in another state, their only contact being brief, coded phone calls that left both mother and daughter fighting back tears. Every call followed the same heartbreaking pattern. "I miss you, Mom," Sarah would whisper, trying to sound brave but unable to hide the tremor in her voice. "When can I come home?" Alice would close her eyes, fighting the urge to abandon everything and run to her daughter. "Soon, baby, just a little longer." "Are you doing your homework?" Staying safe. The mundane questions were a lifeline to normalcy, even as both knew their lives would never be the same. The financial toll mounted relentlessly. Alice's savings were depleted, her career in ruins. The community center had formally terminated her employment, citing conduct unbecoming. Their home, once a sanctuary of mother-daughter memories, had been vandalized repeatedly, windows broken, walls spray-painted with threats and slurs. Owens wasn't faring much better. His law practice was under siege, longtime clients pressured to drop him. Professional colleagues crossed the street to avoid him, his reputation deliberately smeared by Richardson's network. One morning he arrived to find his office ransacked, years of case files destroyed, and a simple message left on his desk: "Walk away or die." But it was the psychological cost that cut deepest. Alice caught glimpses of herself in mirrors and barely recognized the woman staring back, thinner, harder, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant vigilance. The confident mother who had taught her daughter to skateboard seemed like a character from someone else's life. Copeland's presence added another layer of complexity. As he recovered from his wounds, the man who had once struck her in the park revealed depths of remorse that were both painful and necessary to witness. "I see my Sophia in your Sarah," he confessed during one particularly dark night. "That's why I hit you. Couldn't stand seeing what I'd lost, what Richardson took from me." The isolation wore on them all. Their circle of trust had contracted to just 3 people: Alice, Owens, and a wounded man who had once been their enemy. Every casual interaction could be a trap, every friendly face potentially reporting back to Richardson. Even buying groceries became a tactical operation with multiple route changes and constant surveillance checks. Sleep became a luxury none of them could fully trust. Alice would jerk awake at the smallest sound, hand reaching for a weapon, heart pounding with the fear that they'd been found. The hypervigilance was exhausting, but necessary. Richardson's reach seemed to extend everywhere. Most painful were the moments when Sarah's school would call their emergency contact, reporting events. Alice should have been present for her daughter's first solo performance in the school play, a winning goal in soccer, an award for her science project. Each missed milestone was another sacrifice on the altar of justice, another piece of normal life surrendered to their cause. The strain began showing in unexpected ways. Alice found herself crying in random moments while making coffee, checking surveillance footage, cleaning her weapon. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears that spoke of accumulated losses and the weight of constant fear. Owen started sleeping in his office, his home no longer safe after multiple break-in attempts. His own family had distanced themselves, frightened by the dangers surrounding him. Sometimes doing the right thing means losing everything, he said one evening, staring at a photo of his estranged children. Even their small victories felt hollow. Each piece of evidence they gathered, each witness they protected, came at a cost they could feel in their bones. The truth about Richardson's corruption was becoming clearer, but so was the price of exposing it. The turning point came when Sarah's birthday approached. Alice had never missed one, had always made each celebration special despite their limited means. Now she could only send a card through secure channels, hoping it would reach her daughter without revealing her location. "Make a wish for both of us," she wrote, knowing that Sarah would understand both the love and the apology hidden in those words. Later that night, alone in her temporary shelter, Alice finally allowed herself to fully feel the magnitude of what they were sacrificing in their pursuit of justice. Sarah's world had contracted to unfamiliar spaces and borrowed rooms, her childhood suddenly interrupted by adult concerns about safety and secrecy. Her temporary guardians, though kind, couldn't replace the steady presence of her mother or the comfortable routines of their former life. In her new school, she became known as the kid whose mom caused all that trouble. Teachers watched her with a mixture of pity and unease, while classmates alternated between morbid curiosity and cruel exclusion. During lunch breaks, she sat alone, picking at food that never tasted quite right, missing her mother's carefully packed lunches with their little notes of encouragement. The skateboard that had sparked everything gathered dust in a corner. Sarah couldn't bring herself to touch it, each glance bringing back memories of that day in the park. Her nightmares featured Officer Copeland's face twisted with rage, but increasingly they also included scenes of her mother disappearing, fading away like smoke while Sarah called out desperately. The community they'd left behind transformed in their absence. The park where everything began became a symbolic battleground. Some parents avoided it entirely, as if corruption might be contagious. Others made a point of gathering there in small groups, quiet acts of resistance against the fear that had settled over the town. At Sarah's old school, her empty desk became a silent accusation. Children whispered stories, each more dramatic than the last, about what had really happened. Some painted Alice as a hero, others as a troublemaker who should have kept quiet. The truth became malleable, shaped by adult prejudices and fears passed down to children too young to understand the complexity of justice. The impact rippled through unexpected channels. Local businesses that had once welcomed Alice and Sarah found themselves caught in the crossfire. The diner where they'd shared Sunday breakfast lost customers from both sides, those who condemned them for having served troublemakers, and those who couldn't forget how quickly the owners had turned their backs on loyal customers. Sarah's former friends struggled with their parents' conflicting messages. Stay away from anything to do with that family, they were told, even as some of these same parents privately admitted that Alice's stand against corruption was necessary and brave. The children absorbed these contradictions, learning early lessons about the cost of standing up for what's right. In her forced exile, Sarah developed a new kind of strength. She started writing letters she couldn't send, filling notebooks with messages to her mother. "Dear Mom," she would write, "today I stood up to a bully, just like you taught me. He was picking on a smaller kid, and I remembered what you said about being brave even when you're scared." The community center where Alice had worked became a focal point for quiet resistance. Though the official line supported her termination, small acts of defiance emerged. Her old desk remained untouched, a coffee mug still sitting where she'd left it. Staff members would sometimes leave fresh flowers there, a silent message that not everyone had chosen fear over friendship. Sarah's birthday came and went without the usual celebration. But in her temporary home, she blew out a single candle on a store-bought cupcake, making a wish that encompassed everything: for her mother's safety, for justice to prevail, for a chance to return to a life that now seemed like a distant dream. Through it all, Sarah held on to her mother's teachings about courage and integrity. When classmates taunted her about her criminal mother, she stood tall, her response carrying in wisdom beyond her years: "My mom isn't hiding from the law. She's helping the law find its way back to justice." This quiet dignity in the face of isolation impressed even those who had initially judged them harshly. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sarah's resilience began to change perspectives, making people question their own roles in enabling corruption through silence and compliance. In the end, it was a child's photograph that broke Mark Copeland. Recovering in the safe house, he found a picture of Sarah that had fallen from Alice's wallet, the girl smiling broadly, proudly holding up a skateboard. The image overlapped with memories of his own daughter, Sophia, creating a moment of clarity that shattered his remaining defenses. Richardson killed them, he said suddenly one evening, his voice hoarse with emotion. The brake lines on Maria's car, it wasn't an accident. I was getting too soft, questioning too many things. He needed me broken, needed me angry, so he took everything from me. The revelation came with a flood of evidence. Copeland had been meticulously gathering proof since the day he first suspected the truth about his family's death. Hidden in Sophia's music box behind a false bottom lay years of documented corruption audio recordings, financial records, photographs, and detailed notes about Richardson's operation. I couldn't save them, Copeland explained, hands shaking as he handed over the evidence. But I could make sure their deaths meant something. Every time Richardson made me do his dirty work, I kept records. Every threat, every payoff, every cover-up. I was building a case, even when I thought I had nothing left to live for. His testimony, when finally given to federal prosecutors, was devastating in its detail. He described how Richardson had systematically corrupted the department, using a combination of bribes, blackmail, and violence. The commissioner had turned the police force into his personal militia, protecting his criminal enterprises while terrorizing anyone who dared to question his authority. More shocking were the revelations about how Richardson selected his enforcers. He looked for officers with potential weaknesses, Copeland testified. Family problems, financial troubles, personal tragedies. Then he'd exploit those vulnerabilities, sometimes creating the very crises that would make us dependent on him. The depth of Richardson's manipulation became clear as Copeland described his own transformation. After Maria and Sophia died, he was there immediately, offering support, understanding. He directed my grief toward specific targets, mostly minority communities. Made me believe I was serving justice when I was just being his weapon. Each revelation seemed to lift a weight from Copeland's shoulders, even as it added to the horror of Richardson's crimes. He described how the commissioner had orchestrated confrontations like the one with Alice, using personal tragedies to trigger violent responses that could later be used as leverage. The park incident, Copeland admitted, his voice breaking. He knew about my daughter's age, knew Sarah would trigger me, but he didn't expect Alice's strength. When she stood her ground, protected her child, it started bringing back memories of who I used to be before grief made me his puppet. The most damning evidence came from recordings Copeland had made of his meetings with Richardson. In them, the commissioner openly discussed using police power to eliminate rivals, silence witnesses, and maintain his criminal empire. The casual way he ordered deaths, ruined lives, and corrupted justice was chilling. As Copeland's testimony continued, his demeanor changed. The angry, broken man who had struck Alice in the park was replaced by someone seeking redemption through truth. He spoke with a clarity and purpose that revealed the dedicated officer he had once been, before tragedy and manipulation had twisted his path. I can't bring back those I've hurt, he said, looking directly at Alice during a break in testimony. Can't undo the damage I've done, but I can make sure Richardson doesn't break anyone else the way he broke me. The transformation wasn't easy. Each revelation brought fresh waves of guilt as Copeland confronted the full scope of his actions as Richardson's enforcer. There were nights when the weight of his confessions left him sleepless, pacing the safe house, haunted by memories of both his crimes and his losses. But with each truth told, each piece of evidence shared, Copeland seemed to reclaim a piece of his former self. He spoke of Maria and Sophia more frequently, not just with grief, but with loving memories that had been buried under years of rage and manipulation. His testimony became more than just evidence against Richardson. It became a roadmap of corruption's human cost, a chronicle of how power could twist grief into weapon, and ultimately a story of possible redemption through truth. Copeland's testimony unexpectedly unraveled a conspiracy far larger than anyone had anticipated. Richardson, it turned out, wasn't the mastermind, but rather a well-placed pawn in a network that stretched from City Hall to the state capitol. The corruption had roots in decades of carefully orchestrated power plays and silent partnerships. The true architect emerged as Judge Howard Maxwell, a figure so respected that his involvement had seemed impossible. For 30 years, Maxwell had built a facade of judicial integrity while orchestrating a shadow government that controlled everything from construction contracts to drug trafficking routes. Richardson had been his enforcer, Copeland a weapon, and the entire police department a private security force for their illegal empire. Maxwell picked me for promotion to Commissioner, Richardson confessed when finally confronted with overwhelming evidence. He said he saw potential in me, but what he really saw was someone willing to compromise, someone who could be controlled. The former commissioner's confession revealed how Maxwell had systematically placed corrupted officials in key positions, creating a web of mutual blackmail and dependency. The judge's methodology was brilliantly simple: identify promising public servants with hidden weaknesses, exploit those vulnerabilities, then bind them to his organization through a combination of rewards and threats. Copeland's family hadn't been the only tragedy orchestrated to create a loyal enforcer. Other officers had lost loved ones in accidents, faced sudden financial crises, or found themselves implicated in crimes they hadn't committed. Alice's discovery of corruption during her time on the force hadn't been random. She had been selected as a potential recruit, her integrity as a single mother marking her as someone who might be manipulated through threats to her daughter. When she proved incorruptible, the system moved to destroy her career, using the very principles she upheld against her. The park confrontation took on new meaning with these revelations. It hadn't just been about silencing Alice, it had been a calculated move to create a public incident that would discredit any future allegations she might make. Maxwell had orchestrated similar scenarios throughout his career, using public humiliation and manufactured controversies to neutralize potential threats. More disturbing were the connections to legitimate businesses and charitable organizations. The community center where Alice worked, the school Sarah attended, even the church where Copeland sought solace, all had been infiltrated by Maxwell's influence. His network hadn't just corrupted law enforcement, it had woven itself into the very fabric of community life. The evidence trail led to offshore accounts, shell companies, and a sophisticated money laundering operation that had processed millions of dollars. Maxwell's legitimate reputation had provided perfect cover, allowing him to move vast sums of money through charitable foundations and civic improvement projects. Sarah's school records revealed another layer of control. The sudden academic difficulties she faced hadn't been random harassment, but part of a systematic pressure campaign. Maxwell's organization had perfected the art of using children's vulnerabilities to control their parents, a tactic that had silenced numerous potential whistleblowers over the years. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source: Maxwell's own grandson, a junior clerk in his office who had been quietly gathering evidence of his grandfather's crimes. The young man's testimony provided the missing links that connected decades of seemingly unrelated incidents into a clear pattern of orchestrated corruption. This revelation transformed the nature of their fight. It wasn't just about police brutality or local corruption anymore, it was about dismantling a system that had turned their entire community into unwitting accomplices. Each new piece of evidence revealed how deeply Maxwell's influence had penetrated, how carefully he had constructed his empire of corruption. For Alice, understanding the true scope of what they were fighting brought both clarity and concern. The system they were challenging was far more powerful than they had imagined, but exposing its true nature might finally help the community understand why their stand against Copeland had been just the beginning of a much larger battle for justice. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of the trial. Years of corruption were about to be laid bare, and the entire community seemed to hold its breath. Alice sat in the front row, Sarah's hand clasped tightly in hers, their first public reunion since going into hiding. Copeland sat nearby, no longer in uniform, but carrying himself with a dignity that had been absent during his days as Richardson's enforcer. Judge Maxwell's entrance silenced the courtroom. The man who had orchestrated decades of corruption appeared impeccable in his tailored suit, his expression betraying no concern. But as the evidence began to unfold, that mask of confidence slowly cracked. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. Copeland's testimony came first, his voice steady as he detailed how Maxwell had engineered his family's death, turning grief into a weapon. Financial records revealed the intricate web of corruption, each transaction telling a story of power abused and trust betrayed. Former victims stepped forward, their stories painting a picture of systematic oppression. Parents described how their children's futures had been threatened, business owners detailed forced partnerships, and police officers admitted to years of enforcing Maxwell's will rather than the law. The turning point came when Maxwell's grandson took the stand. His testimony, delivered with quiet determination, exposed the intimate details of how his grandfather had built his empire of corruption. Security footage, recorded conversations, and detailed documents left no room for denial. Sarah's testimony, though brief, moved many to tears. She described not just the park incident, but the subtle ways Maxwell's system had poisoned her childhood, the lost friendships, the academic sabotage, the constant fear. Her strength in facing down the man who had orchestrated her family's suffering earned her a standing ovation. The defense attempted to paint Maxwell as a dedicated public servant, the victim of a conspiracy. But their arguments crumbled in the face of overwhelming evidence. When Richardson finally broke ranks and confessed to decades of serving as Maxwell's enforcer, the last pieces fell into place. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Maxwell was found guilty on all counts, his sentence reflecting the magnitude of his crimes. Richardson, Copeland, and others received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation, their testimonies crucial in exposing the full scope of corruption. But the true victory lay in the systemic changes that followed. The Department of Justice appointed independent overseers to reform the police department. New transparency measures were implemented, and a civilian review board was established with real power to investigate misconduct. The community center where Alice had worked offered her not just reinstatement but a leadership position in a new program focused on community advocacy and police accountability. Her experience would help shape a new generation of civic leaders committed to preventing the rise of future Maxwells. Schools underwent their own transformation. Sarah's academic record was restored, and new policies were put in place to protect students from being used as leverage against their parents. The education system, once a tool of control, began evolving into a force for positive change. Local businesses, freed from Maxwell's influence, started rebuilding trust with the community. The diner that had once turned Alice and Sarah away now hosted monthly community dialogue sessions, bringing together police officers and residents to address concerns and build understanding. Copeland's cooperation led to the creation of a support program for officers dealing with trauma and grief, aimed at preventing others from being manipulated through their pain. His story became a cautionary tale taught at the police academy, demonstrating how corruption could twist even dedicated officers. The church where the shootout occurred established a social justice ministry, turning the site of violence into a center for healing and reform. The bullet holes in its walls were preserved as a reminder of the cost of standing against corruption and the importance of moral courage. Perhaps most significantly, the case sparked a national conversation about systemic corruption in small communities. Other towns began examining their own power structures, looking for signs of the subtle control methods Maxwell had perfected. As Alice watched these changes unfold, she realized their victory extended far beyond the courtroom. They had not just exposed corruption, they had demonstrated that ordinary people, standing together, could challenge even the most entrenched systems of power. The day the reforms were officially announced, Sarah turned to her mother with a smile that carried all the hope of a brighter future. "We did it, Mom," she said simply. "We really did it." Alice hugged her daughter close, knowing that while their personal battle was over, the larger fight for justice would continue. But now they had proof that change was possible, that courage could overcome corruption, and that truth, though sometimes delayed, would eventually prevail. The process of healing began slowly, like spring after a long winter. Alice and Sarah moved back into their renovated home, restored by community volunteers who had finally found the courage to show their support. The walls, once covered with threatening graffiti, now bore messages of hope and unity painted by local artists. Their first Sunday back at the diner became an impromptu celebration. Mrs. Anderson, the owner who had once turned them away, served their breakfast herself, tears in her eyes as she apologized. "Fear made cowards of us all," she admitted, "but your courage showed us a better way." Sarah's return to school marked another milestone. Her classmates, educated by events and their own parents' reflections, welcomed her back not as the troublemaker's daughter but as a symbol of resilience. The skateboard that had gathered dust during their exile returned to regular use, Sarah's confidence growing with each new trick mastered. Copeland's transformation continued to surprise everyone. After serving a reduced sentence, he dedicated himself to youth mentoring, working particularly with children from families affected by police misconduct. His greatest breakthrough came when Sarah, after months of hesitation, agreed to attend one of his skateboarding workshops for troubled teens. The moment when Sarah successfully taught Copeland's signature skateboard move became a symbol of healing that touched the entire community. "My Sophia would have loved this," he said quietly, watching Sarah help another young girl find her balance. The pain in his voice was still there, but now it carried hope rather than bitterness. Alice found her own path to healing through her work at the Reformed Community Center. The program she developed, combining advocacy with reconciliation, became a model for other communities struggling with similar histories of corruption. Her experience taught others that justice and healing could coexist. That accountability didn't preclude compassion. The annual community picnic, once segregated by invisible lines of fear and mistrust, became a true celebration of unity. Former opponents found themselves sharing tables, their children playing together, discovering that their differences were far outweighed by their common hopes for a better future. Even those who had been part of Maxwell's system found ways to contribute to the healing process. Reformed officers shared their stories in training sessions, helping new recruits recognize and resist the subtle beginnings of corruption. Their honesty, though sometimes painful, helped rebuild trust between police and community. The church where the shootout occurred hosted monthly reconciliation meetings, where people could share their experiences of both corruption and healing. The bullet holes in its walls, preserved as a reminder, became less a symbol of violence and more a testament to the possibility of transformation. Sarah's 13th birthday party became an unexpected moment of community celebration. The park where everything had started was filled with people from all walks of life, each bringing food, gifts, and most importantly, their presence as a statement of solidarity and hope. During the party, Alice watched her daughter laughing with friends, including children of officers who had once followed Maxwell's orders. The sight brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness or regret, but of joy at witnessing the next generation moving beyond the shadows of the past. The healing wasn't perfect or complete. Some wounds would take years to fully mend, some relationships would never be quite the same. But the community had learned valuable lessons about courage, forgiveness, and the importance of standing together against injustice. As the sun set on the birthday celebration, Sarah led a group of children in a skateboarding demonstration, their wheels echoing against the same pavement where Copeland had once struck Alice. The sound, once a reminder of conflict, now carried the rhythm of renewal and hope. Looking around at the gathered faces, some familiar, some new, all part of their expanded community, Alice realized that their victory had brought more than just justice. It had created space for something equally precious: the chance for healing, for redemption, and for building a future where courage and compassion could flourish together. Dear family, what an incredible journey we've shared today. If Alice's story touched your heart and made you believe in justice again, please hit that subscribe button to support our team's dedication to bringing you these powerful stories. Don't forget to like and share this video with your loved ones, because stories of courage deserve to be heard. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts and emotions. How did Alice's fight for justice move you? And here's the big question: should we create part 2? Let us know in the comments if you want to discover what happens next in this powerful tale of justice and redemption.